The streets were all he knew, a world where survival meant strength, loyalty, and sometimes doing things he never thought he'd be capable of. It was a world where dreams were hard to come by and even harder to chase. Yet, despite the violence, the poverty, and the constant pull of the streets, one young man found himself dreaming of something more. He had no idea how he would escape, but the thought of a better life was like a spark in his chest, one that refused to go out. Growing up in one of the toughest neighborhoods in Chicago, Marcus wasn't just fighting to stay alive, he was fighting for his future. From a young age, he had been thrown into the cycle of gang life, a life that promised security but came with a heavy price. Friends became enemies and trust was as fragile as glass. Every day was a battle, but it wasn't just the streets he was fighting against. It was the system, the expectations, and the doubts that weighed down on him from all sides. How could a kid from the projects ever dream of something bigger, something beyond the chaos of his environment? It wasn't easy. The lure of the streets, the pull of the gang life, and the pressures of survival made it almost impossible for him to see any way out. But deep inside, Marcus always had this quiet, unshakable belief that he was meant for more. The day he walked away from the gang that had raised him was the day his life truly began to change. It wasn't a clean break, it wasn't dramatic, and it wasn't easy. But it was a decision that started him down a path he never thought possible. A path that would take him from the harsh realities of the streets to the ivy-covered walls of Harvard University. How did this young man, raised in one of the most dangerous neighborhoods, end up in one of the most prestigious universities in the world? How did someone who was once part of a gang, caught up in the dangers of that life, find the strength to leave it all behind and pursue an education? How did he go from struggling to survive to becoming a professor at one of the most respected institutions in the world? The journey wasn't simple. There were moments of doubt, of fear, and of failure. There were times when Marcus thought about giving up, when he felt like the weight of his past would pull him back into the darkness. But each time, something inside him told him to keep going, to push forward just a little more. And somehow he did. But the question remains, how did he get there? What were the turning points that shifted his life from one of violence and despair to one of purpose and triumph? And most importantly, what does his story tell us about the power of perseverance, of transformation, and of the human spirit? This is a story of redemption, of hope, and of the unimaginable potential that lies within all of us, no matter where we come from. Marcus's story isn't just about escaping the streets. It's about finding your voice, your purpose, and your place in a world that doesn't always believe in you. It's about proving to yourself and to everyone around you that no matter how dark your past may seem, there's always a chance for a brighter future. But there's still so much more to uncover. The journey is far from over, and the road ahead isn't always smooth. In fact, some of the toughest challenges lay ahead of him, challenges that could threaten to undo everything he's worked for. So how did a kid from the gang life become a Harvard professor? What obstacles did he face along the way, and what sacrifices did he have to make? Stay tuned to find out the incredible, inspiring story of Marcus' rise from the streets to the classroom, and how he defied the odds to achieve the impossible. Marcus sat on the edge of his bed, the walls of his tiny apartment closing in on him. It wasn't much, a rundown place on the south side of Chicago, but it was his. Every corner, every cracked window, and every chipped paint on the walls reminded him of the life he left behind. It was late at night, and the streets outside were as loud as ever, filled with the distant sound of sirens, shouting, and the heavy hum of city life that never seemed to stop. He could hear the echoes of his past, the memories of a life that was all too real and all too close. But tonight, he wasn't thinking about the streets. Tonight, he was thinking about the future. The decision he had made weeks ago was still fresh in his mind. Walking away from the gang had been the hardest thing he'd ever done. It wasn't just about leaving behind a life of violence and danger. It was about letting go of everything he had known, everything that had defined him up until that point. The sense of belonging, the loyalty, the family bond that had once been everything to him. It all had to be left behind. And though Marcus had known it was the right choice, it didn't make it any easier. There were no guarantees in life, and the world outside the gang wasn't kind to someone like him. His friends, the ones he'd grown up with, didn't understand. They didn't see the potential for something more. They thought he was crazy for even considering a life beyond what they knew. And part of him still wondered if they were right. What chance did a kid like him really have? A kid who had been raised in a neighborhood where dreams were often crushed before they had a chance to take root. The first few weeks after his decision were the hardest. He felt isolated, cut off from everything that had given him a sense of purpose. The days felt long, and the nights were filled with restlessness. He couldn't sleep, he couldn't think straight, But deep down, he knew he had to push through it. He had to find a way out. It was during one of these sleepless nights that Marcus stumbled across an old book at a local thrift store. The pages were yellowed with age, and the cover had seen better days, but something about it called to him. It was a book on the history of black scholars and activists, those who had risen from nothing to make a difference in the world. He didn't know why, but he felt drawn to it. As he flipped through the pages, he found stories of people who had come from backgrounds just like his, people who had faced unimaginable odds, yet still managed to succeed. The words on the pages spoke to him in a way nothing else had. It was like the universe had handed him a key to a door he hadn't even known was there. For the first time in a long while, Marcus began to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could be one of those people. He wasn't sure how or where to start, but he knew one thing for sure. He had to get out of Chicago. He had to escape the gravity of his past, of the streets that seemed to have a hold on him, no matter how hard he tried to break free. And so, he started making plans. It wasn't easy. He didn't have a high school diploma, and his record wasn't exactly clean. But there was one thing Marcus had that most people didn't: determination. He enrolled in a GED program, not knowing what to expect but hoping it would be the first step towards something better. Each day, he would sit in the small classroom, surrounded by people from all walks of life, all with their own stories. He felt out of place at first, like an outsider, like he didn't belong. But as the days turned into weeks, something started to change. The lessons weren't just about math or history or reading. They were about hope. They were about possibility. For the first time in years, Marcus started to see a future where he wasn't just surviving, but thriving. It was also during this time that he met a man named Dr. Reynolds, a local professor who had volunteered to help teach the GED classes. Dr. Reynolds was different from anyone Marcus had ever met. He was kind, patient, and most of all, he believed in Marcus. He saw something in him, something that Marcus had never been able to see in himself. One day, after class, Dr. Reynolds pulled him aside. "You've got a fire in you," he said, his voice steady but sincere. "And I think you could do more than just pass a test. I think you could go further than that. You could go to college, Marcus." The words hit Marcus like a ton of bricks. He had never even considered the possibility. Going to college felt like a distant dream, something only for the privileged, the ones who had everything handed to them. But Dr. Reynolds didn't see it that way. He saw a path away for Marcus to build a new future. The conversation stayed with him long after it ended. That night, Marcus sat on his bed, the weight of Dr. Reynolds' words hanging over him. Could he really do it? Could he really go from the streets of Chicago to something bigger? The thought seemed impossible, but deep down, Marcus knew it was the kind of challenge he had been waiting for. And for the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a life beyond the gang, beyond the violence. What if he could go to college? What if he could make a difference? Not just for himself, but for the community he came from. The next few months were a blur of hard work. Marcus spent every waking moment studying, preparing for the GED test, and trying to stay away from the people who had once been his closest friends. The streets still called to him, and there were days when the temptation to return to that life was almost overwhelming. But he knew he couldn't go back, not after everything he had learned, not after seeing a glimpse of the future that could be his if he just kept going. When he finally passed his GED, Marcus felt a sense of relief, but also a new sense of purpose. He was one step closer to his dream, but he also knew the journey wasn't over. The next hurdle was applying to colleges, something he had no idea how to navigate. He had no family to guide him, no connections to help him. He was on his own. The thought of applying to schools like Harvard seemed laughable at first. It was so far removed from the life he had known. But something inside him refused to let go of the dream. After weeks of poring over applications, essays, and recommendations, he finally submitted his application to Harvard. He didn't expect to hear back. In fact, he tried to prepare himself for rejection. But something told him that no matter the outcome, he had already accomplished something incredible. He had fought his way out of the darkness, and that in itself was a victory. But as the days passed and the silence stretched on, Marcus found himself consumed by doubt. Had he done enough? Was he really meant to be in a place like Harvard? He didn't know, but he knew this. He had already come too far to turn back now. And then, one morning, the letter came. Marcus stood frozen in his small apartment, the letter in his hands feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The envelope was pristine, the Harvard crest embossed on the front, mocking him with its elegance. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but never like this. Never in a way that made him feel so small, so unworthy. He could hear the sounds of the city drifting in through the thin walls, distant voices that seemed so far removed from the world he was about to step into. The world of privilege, the world of opportunity, the world that had always felt out of reach. For a moment, he wondered if he had been too hasty in even applying. What did someone like him have to offer a place like Harvard? His fingers trembled as he tore open the envelope, pulling out the letter. He couldn't bring himself to read the words just yet, so he stood there, staring at the paper in his hands, fighting the storm of emotions that churned inside him. Doubt, fear, hope, they all tangled together, a knot in his chest that wouldn't loosen. Then finally, he unfolded the letter, and as his eyes skimmed over the words, his heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a rejection. It wasn't an acceptance either. Instead, it was an invitation to an interview. Marcus blinked, not sure if he was reading the letter correctly. An interview? For Harvard? Was this a mistake? Was someone playing a cruel joke on him? How could he possibly stand a chance against students who had spent their entire lives preparing for this moment? For the next few days, Marcus found himself consumed with uncertainty. He knew this was his one shot, his only chance to prove that he could be more than the sum of his past. But how could he convince a group of strangers that he deserved to be there? How could he explain the years he had spent in the streets, the mistakes, the scars that no one could see? He spent hours preparing for the interview, practicing his answers, rehearsing his story. But every time he stood in front of the mirror, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't enough. That no matter how much he worked, how much he tried to change, he would always be the kid from the wrong side of the tracks. And then there was the gang. They hadn't let him go so easily. They had tried to pull him back in, promising him money, power, security. The things he had always been told would bring him happiness. Every phone call, every message, every confrontation with old friends was a reminder of how hard it was to leave the streets behind. The temptation to return was always there, lingering in the back of his mind. Some days it felt easier to go back to what he knew, to the gang that always had his back, the people who had never judged him for his past. But he couldn't. He couldn't go back to that life. Not after everything he had worked for. Not after all the pain and struggle that had brought him here, to this very moment. Still, the pressure was mounting. He had told the gang he was done, but they weren't done with him. The constant reminders, threats veiled as friendly warnings, were wearing him down. Each time they contacted him, Marcus felt the weight of his decision growing heavier. He had already lost so much, had already alienated so many people. Was Harvard even worth it? Was the life he dreamed of worth the pain of leaving everything behind? On the other hand, there was Dr. Reynolds, the man who had believed in him when no one else had. He'd have been a steady source of encouragement through this entire journey, but even his words of wisdom couldn't quiet the doubts in Marcus's mind. "You're not defined by your past, Marcus," Dr. Reynolds had told him more than once. "You're defined by what you do now. It's the choices you make that will shape your future, not the mistakes you've made in the past." But it was hard for Marcus to believe that. How could someone who had lived a life so different from everyone else ever fit into a world like Harvard? He felt like an imposter, like he didn't belong. Each time he imagined walking into that interview room, he saw himself as a stranger, someone who didn't belong in the same space as the privileged students who had grown up with every opportunity. As the interview date drew closer, Marcus could feel the pressure building. It was like the walls of his apartment, the streets outside, the gang, everything were closing in on him. He couldn't escape it. The expectations, the fear of failure, the fear of rejection. And yet he knew he couldn't back down. He had come too far. The night before the interview, Marcus couldn't sleep. He paced back and forth, running through his story in his head over and over again. He knew he had to be honest about who he was, about where he came from. But how much should he reveal? How could he explain the choices he had made, the things he had done? Would they judge him for his past, or would they see the person he was becoming? At 3 a.m., there was a knock at the door. Marcus froze. No one knocked on his door at this hour. Not unless they were looking for something or someone. He opened the door cautiously, and standing there was Deshawn, one of the guys from the gang. His face was unreadable, but Marcus could see the familiar weight of disappointment in his eyes. "Yo, Marcus," Deshawn said, his voice low and steady. "We need to talk." Marcus stepped outside, closing the door behind him. He didn't want the others to hear this. He had made it clear to Deshawn and the others that he was done, that he wasn't coming back, but Deshawn wasn't having it. "You think you're too good for us now?" Deshawn asked, his voice rising slightly. "You think you can just walk away from everything we've been through? From the family? You think Harvard's gonna take care of you like we do?" The words stung, but Marcus held his ground. He knew it was at stake. He had to make a choice, once and for all. The gang's grip on him, the life he had known, all of it, it had to end here. "I'm not like you anymore, Deshawn," Marcus said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I'm done with that life. I want something better. I'm not going back." Deshawn's eyes narrowed, his jaw clenching. "You'll regret it. You'll see." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Marcus standing in the darkness, heart pounding in his chest. The next morning, Marcus stood in front of the mirror, staring at the reflection of a man he barely recognized. His face was older, hardened by years of struggle, but there was something else in his eyes, a spark, a fire. He wasn't done yet. He couldn't be, not now. But the question remained, could he really walk away from everything he knew? Could he survive this new world? Would he be able to handle the pressure? And most of all, would he make it to that interview and prove to them, and to himself, that he belonged there? The clock was ticking, and the tension was mounting. The day of the interview arrived like a storm on the horizon, and Marcus could feel the pressure building in every corner of his mind. The weight of his past was pressing down on him like never before, and with every step he took toward that campus, the doubts only grew louder. The echo of Deshawn's words, "You'll regret it," haunted him. He had made it this far, but was he really ready to leave everything behind? Was he really ready to step into a world where he didn't belong? A world where he felt like an outsider every time he imagined himself in it? The morning was cold, the chill biting through his thin jacket as he walked toward the bus stop. The city was waking up around him, people rushing past, heads down, too busy to notice the turmoil unfolding inside him. It was just another morning in Chicago, but for Marcus, it was a defining moment. He had come this far, and now it was time to face the culmination of everything he had fought for. But the closer he got to the bus stop, the more his thoughts spiraled. What if they didn't see the person he had become? What if they saw only the past he was trying to escape, the mistakes that had defined him for so long? What if they saw the gang tattoos still visible on his arms, the scars that told stories of battles fought in a life that he was trying to forget? He had tried to hide them, tried to cover them up with sleeves, with long jackets. But he knew that no matter what, he couldn't escape who he was, no matter how hard he tried. As he sat on the bus, staring out the window, he couldn't stop the flood of memories. The gang, the drugs, the violence, the loyalty that had bound him to a life he had known for years. All of it. He had left it behind, but the pole was always there, lingering like a shadow, reminding him that no matter how far he ran, it could always drag him back. The bus ride felt like an eternity. The world outside passed by in flashes of color and motion, but Marcus couldn't focus on anything other than the storm inside his head. What if they asked him about his past? What if they wanted to know why he had been arrested, or why he had turned his life upside down to pursue something as out of reach as Harvard? He couldn't lie about it, and he couldn't pretend to be someone he wasn't. But would they accept him for the truth? Or would they see only the criminal, the kid from the wrong side of the tracks? By the time the bus pulled up to the campus, Marcus was barely holding it together. His heart was pounding in his chest, and his hands were clammy, the sweat of nerves making his palms sticky. He had prepared for this moment, had visualized it in his mind 1,000 times. But now that he was here, standing in front of the massive gates of Harvard University, all the preparations felt like they were for nothing. Nothing could prepare him for the reality of this moment, the reality of what it meant to walk through those gates. He wasn't sure he belonged here, but he had no choice but to walk forward. The heavy weight of the decision, of the life he had chosen, pressed against his shoulders. This was it. This was his moment. And if he didn't step through those doors, he would never know if he had what it took. The interview was set in a room at the top of one of the grand buildings on campus. As Marcus made his way through the hallways, he was struck by the contrast between this world and the one he had come from. The polished floors, the clean-cut students in their designer clothes, the professors with their air of authority. Everything screamed privilege, opportunity, success. And here he was, a kid from the streets, walking through these halls like he didn't belong. Like he was an intruder in a world that wasn't meant for him. The interview room was even more intimidating than he had imagined. A long table stretched in front of him, with 3 people seated behind it, 2 older men in suits and a younger woman with glasses. They all looked up as he entered, and for a split second, Marcus felt the weight of their gaze on him, as if they were already judging him before he even spoke. "Peace it," one of the men said, his voice smooth but distant. Marcus sat down, his body tense, his mind racing. He tried to steady his breathing, to calm his nerves, but it was no use. Every question they asked felt like a test he wasn't sure he could pass. "So, Marcus," the younger woman began, "tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, your experiences." It was the question he had been dreading. How could he sum up his life in a few short sentences? How could he explain the choices he had made, the people he had hurt, the things he had done, without sounding like a failure, without feeling like he was still a kid lost in the streets? He hesitated for a moment, gathering his thoughts. Then he spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "I come from a tough neighborhood in Chicago. I've made mistakes and I've paid for them. But I'm not the person I was. I'm working every day to be better, to do better. I want to prove that no matter where you come from, you can change your life. You can make a difference." It wasn't the perfect answer. It wasn't the answer they were expecting, but it was the truth. And for the first time in a long while, Marcus felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, this world was starting to see him for who he was becoming, not who he had been. The questions continued. They asked about his academic achievements, about the challenges he had faced in his personal life, about his goals and aspirations. Every question felt like an obstacle, another mountain he had to climb. But Marcus kept going. He refused to stop, refused to let them see how afraid he really was. Then, out of nowhere, the tone shifted. One of the men leaned forward, his gaze sharp and intense. "Marcus," he said, his voice suddenly cold, "you mentioned that you've had some run-ins with the law. Can you explain what happened there? How do we know you won't be a liability to our community?" The room seemed to shrink, the air thick with tension. Marcus felt his throat tighten, his heart pounding in his ears. He hadn't prepared for this. How could he explain something like this? How could he defend his past when all he wanted to do was run from it? But he couldn't run. He couldn't hide. He had to face it, face them, and face himself. "I've made mistakes," Marcus said, his voice trembling but steady. "But I've learned from them. I'm not proud of what I did, but I'm not the same person anymore. I'm here because I want to prove that I can be more than my past. I want to show that I can contribute, that I can be part of something bigger." The silence that followed felt like an eternity. The three professors exchanged glances, their faces unreadable. Marcus could barely breathe, could barely hold himself together. Every moment that passed felt like it was slipping away, and he had no control over it. Finally, the younger woman spoke. "Thank you, Marcus. We'll be in touch soon." And with that, the interview was over. Marcus stood up, his legs shaking, his heart still racing. He could feel the eyes of the professors on his back as he walked out of the room, but he didn't dare turn around. The tension was unbearable, the uncertainty overwhelming. The hardest part was over, but the hardest question still lingered in the air. Would he make it? Would he get the chance to prove himself, to build the life he had always dreamed of, or would his past hold him back forever? As Marcus left the building and stepped back out into the world, he knew one thing for sure. No matter what happened next, he had already fought for his future. Now all he could do was wait and pray that the world would see him for what he had become, not for what he had been. Marcus walked out of the building, the cold air biting at his skin as he made his way down the steps, his mind spinning. He had survived the interview, but what did it really mean? He couldn't help but feel like something wasn't right, like there was still something hanging over him, something he hadn't yet reckoned with. The weight of the questions, the moments when they had challenged him, all of it left a lingering unease in his chest. He tried to shake off the feeling, telling himself he had done all he could. Now it was out of his hands. But as he made his way toward the bus stop, a strange feeling crept up his spine. The campus had emptied out a little by then. Most students had gone to lunch or were tucked away in their dorms. The streets were quieter, the noise of the city a dull hum in the distance. It was then that he heard footsteps behind him, slow, measured, and then a voice called out, sending a shock through his body. "Marcus, wait up." He turned around, heart racing. Standing there, just a few feet away, was Deshawn. His presence hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. What was he doing here? How had he found him? "What the hell are you doing here?" Marcus asked, trying to keep his voice steady but failing. "I told you I'm done. This is my chance, man. My only chance. What do you want from me?" Deshawn smirked, his arms crossed over his chest. "You think you're gonna leave all this behind? You think you're gonna walk into some Ivy League school like you're some kind of saint? They'll eat you alive. You're not meant for that life, Marcus." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. The tension between them was thick, palpable. Deshawn had always been the one to keep him tied to the past, to the streets, to the gang. But Marcus had worked so hard to get away from that life. He couldn't go back, not now. "I'm not going back," Marcus said firmly. "I told you I'm done with that life. I'm not letting you drag me back in. I've got something better ahead of me." Deshawn took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. You think you're the first one to say that? You think you're the first one to try to leave? You don't get to just walk away from the streets, Marcus. You think they'll just let you? They won't, and neither will I. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. Deshawn wasn't just trying to hold him back. He was threatening him. But why? He had made it clear that he was done with the gang, that he wanted to start fresh. Was it about power? Control? What's this really about, Deshawn? Marcus asked, his voice rising. Why are you here? What do you want from me? Deshawn's expression shifted, and for the first time, Marcus saw something else in his eyes. Something darker, more menacing. I've been watching you, Deshawn said slowly, his voice low. I know what you did, Marcus. I know what you've been up to. Marcus froze, a cold chill running down his spine. What are you talking about? Deshawn stepped closer, his eyes never leaving Marcus's face. I've got my sources. You think you're going to get away clean? That they won't look into your past? You think you're gonna walk into Harvard and they won't find out everything you've done? The gang? The drugs? The arrests? It's all there, Marcus. And once they find out, you'll be out of here faster than you can say scholarship. You'll be nothing but a failure again. Marcus felt the ground shift beneath him. Was Deshawn threatening to ruin his chance? Was he going to sabotage him in the worst possible way? The reality of it all hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. He had thought he could leave it all behind, but now Deshawn was using his past as leverage. The gang had always had a hold on him, but this was something else entirely. Don't you dare, Marcus said, his voice shaky but filled with a sudden fierce resolve. I'm done with you. I'm done with that life. I don't need your help, and I don't need your threats. I'll make it on my own. Deshawn smirked again, a cruel, almost sadistic smile crossing his face. You think you're the first to try and leave, Marcus? The streets don't forget, and neither do I. We'll see how long you last before everything comes crashing down. With that, Deshawn turned and walked away, leaving Marcus standing there, breathless and shaking, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Marcus stood frozen for a moment, replaying the conversation in his mind. Was Deshawn bluffing? Or was he really capable of bringing down everything Marcus had worked so hard for? The stakes had never been higher. Everything he had fought for, his future, his chance at Harvard, was now in jeopardy. The past that had haunted him for so long, the things he had tried to escape, were threatening to come crashing back in. As he walked away from the bus stop, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't control. The interview had only been the beginning, and now with Deshawn's threat hanging over him, Marcus found himself in the fight of his life. He had made it this far, but was it enough to keep the past from consuming him? Would he really get a chance to prove who he had become, or would everything unravel before we could even start? The uncertainty, the fear, the pressure, it was all closing in on him. And as the day stretched on, Marcus could feel the tension rising higher than ever. The hardest battle was still ahead. He wasn't sure if he would win, but one thing was certain. This was far from over. The stakes were higher now than he had ever imagined, and it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. The days after Deshawn's confrontation felt like an eternity. Marcus couldn't escape the tension that gripped him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same thing. The door to his future slowly closing, his dreams slipping through his fingers because of the past that still hunted him. He couldn't afford to let Deshawn or anyone else tear down what he had fought for. But the threat hung over him like a dark cloud, and every interaction, every moment on campus, felt like he was one step away from being exposed. It was the day after his final exam that the letter came, an official-looking envelope with the Harvard insignia. Marcus's heart skipped a beat as he ripped it open. Your life around have impressed us. We believe you will be a valuable asset to our community." Marcus stared at the screen, his mind reeling. What just happened? Was it real? He reread the message, the shock slowly settling into a sense of disbelief. Then the final twist hit him. The real mastermind behind this wasn't Deshaun, and it wasn't even the people who had been trying to sabotage him. It was someone from within the Harvard admissions team. Someone who had seen his potential, seen his struggle, and had quietly worked behind the scenes to ensure he succeeded, regardless of the forces trying to pull him down. Marcus didn't know who it was yet, but he had a sense. Someone who understood what it meant to fight for a second chance, someone who had been where he was. And as he stood there in the dim light of the campus, the weight of everything he had overcome pressing down on him, Marcus realized that the real battle wasn't just for his future. It was for his place in a world that never expected him to belong. But now, with everything hanging in the balance, Marcus knew one thing for sure. He wasn't just going to survive, he was going to thrive. And no one, no matter who they were, could take that from him. As Marcus stood there, the weight of the text message in his hands, everything began to settle into place. The tension he had carried for so long, the uncertainty, the fear, started to melt away. The battle for his future had not only been won, but he had learned something crucial along the way. Sometimes, the most extraordinary victories come from the most unexpected places. It wasn't the elite who held the power over him. It was his own determination, his willingness to fight, and the quiet, unseen people who believed in him. As the realization sank in, Marcus's thoughts drifted to Deshaun. Despite the threats, the manipulation, the fear that Deshaun had tried to instill in him, Marcus knew that he had to let go of that part of his past. He had grown up in the same world as Deshaun, faced the same struggles, but he had found a different path, a path that led him to Harvard, to a chance to rewrite his story. He had earned this, no one could take that from him. The next few weeks were a blur. Marcus spent his time preparing for the next chapter, getting ready for the transition from student to professor. But even as he took these steps forward, the memories of his past kept coming back in flashes. The neighborhood, the people who had been there for him, the moments when he had felt like everything was slipping through his fingers. They all shaped who he had become, and he would never forget that. When Marcus walked onto the campus for his first day as a Harvard professor, he couldn't shake the sense of disbelief. The journey from gang life to academia had been unimaginable, and yet here he was, standing in front of a classroom full of eager young students. As he glanced out at their faces, he felt the weight of the moment. He wasn't just there to teach. He was there to inspire, to show them that no matter where they came from, they had the power to change their lives. The first lecture was intense, but it was also something he had dreamed of for so long. As he spoke about resilience, overcoming adversity, and the importance of education, Marcus couldn't help but think back to everything that had brought him to this moment. He remembered the nights when he thought there was no way out, when the only escape seemed to be through the very thing he was now teaching against. But he had fought through it all, and now he was on the other side. As the semester went on, Marcus made a habit of staying after class, talking with his students, and encouraging them to aim higher than they thought possible. He knew how easy it was to get trapped in the mindset that they weren't good enough or that their circumstances would define them forever. But he was living proof that it wasn't true. His story began to spread across the campus, and it wasn't long before he was invited to speak at events, share his experiences, and offer mentorship to others who were trying to break free from their own pasts. People looked at him differently now, not as the product of a broken system, but as someone who had used that very system to his advantage. Marcus was a symbol of change, a testament to what could be achieved when you refuse to let life dictate your future. Yet, even as his career blossomed, the past never truly left him. Deshaun and the gang still lingered in the shadows, but Marcus had learned how to live in the present and focus on the future. He knew there would always be people trying to drag him back, trying to use his history against him. But now, he had something stronger. He had purpose. He had found peace within himself. One evening, as he sat in his office, preparing for the next lecture, Marcus received an unexpected visit. It was from an old friend, one of the people who had stood by him during his darkest days. This friend had stayed out of the gang life, found a way to make a living, and now worked as a community organizer. "Marcus," his friend began, "I've been following your story, and it's inspiring. I'm proud of you. But we both know there are still people out there who need to hear it. There are kids out there who meet someone like you to show them it's possible to get out." Marcus looked at his friend, nodding slowly. He had always known that his journey wasn't just about him. It was about others. It was about the ones who hadn't yet found their way out, who were still stuck in the cycles that Marcus had been trapped in for so long. "We can do more," Marcus said finally, his voice full of conviction. "We can show them that there's a way out. We can give them the tools, the support. I don't want to just teach in this classroom. I want to go back into the community, reach out to the ones who are still struggling." His friend smiled, clearly seeing the fire in Marcus's eyes. "I knew you'd say that. Let's make it happen." And just like that, Marcus's story came full circle. He wasn't just a professor at Harvard anymore. He was a bridge, a connection between the world of academia and the streets he had once called home. He would take everything he had learned and use it to help those who needed it most, to show them that there was a way out, a way to build a future that didn't rely on the past. As Marcus stood in front of his class that day, he realized something. The true measure of success wasn't in the degrees, the titles, or the accolades. It was in the impact you had on others, in the lives you changed, in the hope you inspired. And with that knowledge, Marcus was more certain than ever that he had made the right choice. He had taken control of his destiny. He had defied the odds, and now he was ready to help others do the same. The journey wasn't easy. It wasn't perfect, but it was his. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Marcus had truly gone from gang life to Harvard professor. But more than that, he had found his purpose, his voice, and his peace. And with that, he knew he would never stop fighting for what was possible, not just for himself, but for the world he was helping to build, one student at a time.